Welcome to Order Militaris Radio TV, and we're lifelong Catholics. And what we do is all for free, and for our love of Jesus Christ, and for our Holy Mother, the Church. We'll defend our Holy Mother, the Church. Today, we're going to begin a series on the real Jack Ryan, and it will all be coming from this book.
The Murder of the Real Jack Ryan.
Yep. And so we've known about Jack. We all heard the name Jack Ryan, read the books by Tom Clancy, watched those films. There's still a next Netflix series on the fictional character Jack Ryan. Today, in a few days onward, we're going to tell you about the real Jack Ryan, and and so we're going to begin with how everything started. And welcome, Brother Alexis, to the program.
Thank you, AJ, for having me on the program. This is going to be fascinating because the real people are life stories is much more adventurous, and because it's real, it's even more amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a devout Catholic that served his country in as much as he knew it was right to serve, and it was in the age in which the United States wasn't yet as corrupt as it is, and who appears to have been murdered because he wanted to prevent the Vietnam War and uphold the Catholic government in South Vietnam. And those will be for the latest episodes. We'll discuss how he really was murdered and who was behind it. But today's program is going to be the making of Jack Ryan, and we'll begin with how the writing down of the true story came to happen.
Yeah, so the Ryan cousins sat down for lunch at the cafe in Edna, Minnesota, a suburb of Minneapolis that their family helped to found. They had come from across the country for one of their periodic get-togethers and began catching up on their lives. Eventually, the conversation turned to Jack Ryan, not the fictional CIA character, their Jack Ryan. Tell us about Jack, one cousin said to two others, who were regarded as the keepers of the flame. Jack had been the family's shining star, the World War II hero whose career seemed pointed toward the highest levels of government service. He was a cold warrior in every sense of the term, and he pursued American policy goals in the far corners of the world. Among his associates were such 1960 notables as Hubert H. Humphrey, Dean Rusk, Henry Cabot Lodge, and General William Westmoreland. The Ryan family members who cited his accomplishments and recalled his frequent absences, which he chalked up to his job with the Office of Public Safety, an obscure government agency created by John F. Kennedy. Jack rarely returned to the States after joining LPS, and his letters home carried postmarks from Laos, the Congo, Indonesia, and South Vietnam. All of the locations were Cold War hotspots where the U.S. was focused on countering communist insurgencies, and his family believed he was really working for the CIA, regardless of who issued his paycheck. Like the hero of books and films, Jack Ryan seemed to live the American ideal in service to his country, but sometimes life takes more surprising turns than fiction. He was gunned down in Saigon, not by Viet Cong, but by members of the U.S. Army Special Forces. His 1965 death left a gaping wound in the family, which never believed what they were told about his slaying. Their limited knowledge of this shadowy work convinced the Ryans that after years of top secret work in Southeast Asia, he was a man who knew too much. His death was front page news but quickly faded from the view as the Vietnam War escalated and provided new daily headlines. As years passed, the Ryans learned more bits and pieces of information that only fed their doubts. about the account of his murder. The cousins finished their lunch in Edna and eventually returned to their far-flung homes. But something had been different about this reunion. Not long afterward, phones began to ring, and they decided that the talk had gone on long enough. It was time to learn the story of the real Jack Ryan.
Okay, so the author of this biography, what's his name?
Daniel P. Sullivan.
So I guess he's the one they recruit to put it all down. And did he say in the preface how many years it took, or research it took,
Um,
or how long that meeting of cousins was until the book went to publication?
no,
Hmm. What year was this book published?
let's see here. Even 2020.
Okay, so it's very recent. Okay, so this is something that almost no one's going to have heard of. So Jack Ryan was a series of novels by Tom Clancy, who's a very famous writer who made more than 100 million royalties. The Search for Red October, which was endorsed by Ronald Reagan and sold 2 million copies in the US, and a lot of movie deals, book deals. And he himself was a Catholic Irishman. So, so what you don't usually see in movies, though, is that these famous men had a religion. And Jack Ryan was a devout Roman Catholic, and so was his family. So The Making of Jack Ryan is the title of this program. And this is an important thing. I want to emphasize to all families out there, especially young people. Why is it important to live faithful Catholic lives, marry someone who's a faithful Catholic, and live an ordered, loving, devout, faith-filled Catholic life as a family? Because great men come from good families. And this Jack Ryan is a perfect example of that. And so AJ wants to tell you about his family and how it came to be that Jack Ryan was born into this family and what's this family's values stood for. So
Yeah,
go to it, AJ. We'll start with his grandfather.
yeah. Before Jack Ryan's family could tackle the mystery of his murder, they had to know more about who he was. His rare visits and infrequent communication during the last 10 years of his life has provided only faint hints of what he was doing. Exotic locales, secret work, association with powerful people. But who was he really? Unraveling the story of Jack Ryan began by pulling on a thread spun through 4 generations. His great grandfather, Patrick William Ryan, was 17 when he left Ireland, County Tipperary, in 1847 during the Great Famine. He was a familiar tale. The Irish population fell from almost 8.4 million in 1844 to 6.6 million by 1851, for more than half of the total decline a result of immigration. Patrick entered the United States through the New York harbor, not yet graced by the Statue of Liberty, moved on to Pennsylvania, then Ohio, before eventually making his way to an area in Minnesota, settled a few years earlier by other Irish who had fled the famine. The settlement just south of Minneapolis became known as the Hard Scrabble Hill for its rolling landscape sprinkled with rocks, boulders left behind when glaciers retreated. The name fit the life as well as families cobbled together a living from the land they had to clear of trees and stones. Patrick arrived in 1854, the same year Father Thomas Cahill began offering Mass in the home of John Dugan for, a new, for the newly founded St. Patrick's Catholic Parish. It was just 2 years after the government had relocated a Sioux tribe from the area and 4 years before Minnesota would become a state.
The Irish were real pioneers. I think most of the Catholic churches in the United States are founded by Irish priests and Irish missionaries. And we have to thank the Irish for that, as much as you like them or don't like them. But they and the German Catholics brought the faith to the Midwest, and their churches are all very beautiful. much more beautiful than the modern churches built after Vatican II.
Yeah, so in America, the Irish could own their land without restriction. Patrick's labors earned him enough money to purchase 160 acres at $1.25 for an acre in 1857. Grateful,
That's an amazingly low price. You see, the dollar was worth something.
grateful for his good fortune, he sold part of his land that same year for the St. Patrick's Church site, and a log building was donated by Michael Delancey. The Irish of Cahill settlement, named after the parish priest, next turned their attention to educating their children, hiring a teacher for $150 to conduct classes in the log building. The school year was set around a spring vacation for planting and fall vacation for harvesting. The population began to grow rapidly a mile away, where Minchala, Min, Minchaha Creek provided the power to mill grain on the government contract with nearby Fort Snelling. So residents loaded the log school building onto skids, hitched it up oxen, and hauled it across the snow to the new location, closer to where the most children were living. Growing ever more comfortable in this new land, Patrick began courting John Duggan's daughter, Catherine. The Duggans had come up from the Mississippi River from St. Louis, a popular route before railroads stretched to the farthest reaches of the northern United States. The Duggans had been beset by tragedy shortly after arriving in Minnesota when Catherine's mother went outside with a lamp after hearing a noise one night. She accidentally set fire to the straw roof on the makeshift home, and one of her children died in the blaze. Patrick and Catherine married and began to build a life in Cahill, but their plans were interrupted in August of 1862 by the outbreak of the Dakota War. When it was created in 1849, the Minnesota's territory, which included the current state boundaries and about half of the Dakotas, had been home to more than 30,000 Indians, only about 5,000 European settlers. By 1854, when Patrick arrived, the number of settlers had grown to roughly equal the Indian population. 3 years later, when he bought land at Cahill, the settlers' population was more than 150,000, and the tribes were being squeezed out. The Lower Sioux Agency, about a day's ride west of Cahill, was visited on August 15, 1862, by a group of starving Dakota Sioux who came from the nearby reservation to trade for food. The tribe's crops had failed and government payments promised to them had not been delivered. A government representative, Andrew J. Merrick, rejected their pleas and was said to have responded, "So far as I am concerned, if they are hungry, let them eat grass." 2 days later, a small group of Dakotas from the reservation killed 5 settlers, including Merrick, whose mouth was stuffed with grass. The next day, larger group of Dakota warriors attacked the agency building, killing 20 settlers and government employees. The survivors gathered their families and fled to Fort Ridgely. About 400 warriors attacked the 280 soldiers and civilians, defending the unwalled U.S. Army compound that was not designed for war. By the time word of violence had spread for miles around, Patrick grabbed a shotgun he had brought over from Ireland, and with Catherine's brother William Duggan joined the group of volunteers, heading to relieve the Fort Rigby defenders. The force grew to 800 on August 22nd, attacked by several times throughout the day, but the soldiers and civilians inside the fort buildings repulsed each advance. The Indians eventually pulled back and laid siege for 5 more days until the arrival of a force of 1,400 militiamen, including Patrick.
I just want to point out some two things. He was allowed to come in the United States with a shotgun, and he wasn't even a citizen. Talk
Mm,
about gun rights that don't exist anymore. The other
yeah,
thing is, as soon as he hears of it, he snaps into action. And we're going to see this about the Ryan family. They have an excellent, noble spirit, generation from generation to generation. They weren't like someone else can fight this war. They were
Yeah.
always like, I'm an American now. I'm going to defend my country.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent sense of patriotism for Catholics that's been lost through so much Marxist um, ideology and fake Catholic spirituality.
Yep. So now we're going to talk about his father, Ed Ryan, the father of Jack Ryan. Um, Ed was just 21 years old when he got the call to go overseas to the 408th Telegraph Battalion, ordered to train bound for the docks at Hoboken in the cold rain on November 22nd. The men filed onto the Carpathia, the liner that had rescued survivors of the Titanic in 1912, and still had two of the Titanic's lifeboats on board. They were ordered below decks until the ship was out of sight from land to thwart any German spies on shore. And so they got through the Halifax, Nova Scotia, and joined the convoy with 10 other freighters and ocean liners and made it to England.
This is the First World War.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm. So his father signed up to fight that war.
Uh,
Another point I want to make out is both the Dugan family, who's his mother, and his father, well, both the families that worked together to build the local parish. These weren't went to mass and gave 25 cents people. Uh, these are people who knew that they had to build their local parish and support their local parish and see that the faith grew and support the local school, Catholic school. So these were Catholics who understood that you can't separate private and public life. You're supposed to be a Catholic in both realms. An excellent example, and this is what built America. This is what built Western civilization, and
yeah.
we need to get back to that. So,
So,
what did he do in the First World War? His dad.
so on December 12th, nearly 3 weeks after leaving camp, they they stepped foot on French soil. The men of the 408 Telegraph Battalion traveled by train from Le Havre to Orleans, where they were given 5 hours to explore during a stopover. Then, once Ed stepped down, his transformation began almost immediately. No longer was, I'm a young person. Now, when he stepped foot on the ground in Orleans, the home of Joan of Arc, he changed.
He started to get serious in life. And so, what does he end up doing in the First World War in the Telegraph
So
Division?
they were, so they were sent to be let's see here, help resupply and help set up the communications.
Mm-hmm.
So Ed's Company E had a good billet in Bordeaux, so good that the battalion's history later would record the company was, figuratively speaking, in clover. They were the only American troop in the city, about 125 miles south of Paris, and were welcomed into residence homes. In addition, an American Red Cross opened a canteen where the soldiers would spend free time. Then on Sunday morning, Ed set off for morning mass at 6 o'clock at the Bourges Cathedral. An ornate structure whose construction had begun in the 12th century. It was still dark as he passed through the doors to the sound of the choir singing. Suddenly the sun shone through the tall windows, throwing bright light of all the colors of that throng of worshippers. He called later. It was like a medieval pageant. While never particularly religious man, the experience would stay with him for the rest of his life.
So it's important to have beautiful churches because people need that help.
So, by the beginning of March, the Americans were beginning to taste the reality of war in France. Germany was about to begin the major offensive on the Western Front and shelled American positions near the village of Bacaudet, killing 22 U.S. soldiers. Ed was confident that the American expeditionary force was up to any challenge the Germans presented. They'll find that fighting Americans is a little different than fighting lime juicers and frogs, British and English, French. He wrote to his mother, referring to the British and French. They're going to run into a lot of hard luck as soon as they see you. He also assured her that he was being well fed. Anytime a cook doesn't get enough to eat, there's something wrong, he wrote, then added, I could stand a cake though. He weighed in at 210 pounds. I'd much rather weigh about 180 and be in good shape than weigh 210 pounds and be fat, as is the case now, he wrote. The consensus among the battalion's men was that they'd be home by Christmas 1918, but Ed had his doubts that it would be that easy. He had visited St. Gervais at St. Potas Church in Paris, and later learned that it had nearly been destroyed by a long-range German siege gun, killing 91 people and injuring 68 attending Mass on Good Friday. The cannon had been fired from about 75 miles away.
Sounds like some other nation that's doing things like that today.
Yeah. So when he was on leave, he was like, he saw the sign announcing the Louvre, the museum,
The
Louvre.
Louvre.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Above the station platform, he got off and headed up the stairs. He stopped in his tracks when he saw the world's most famous art museum before him, and he emerged on the busy Paris streets. He spent 6 hours inside before deciding it was time to return to camp, his senses having been immersed in the treasury of art. That was some township, he later wrote his mother in a bit of a Midwestern understatement. Ed had only a 10th grade education behind him, but he was feeling his insatiable appetite for learning. He continued to use his army pay to buy train tickets to visit Paris and provincial cities, but his duties in Nogent always remained. And one day he was baking biscuits when a group of young people approached. As he handed out samples of some of them, his eyes fell upon Georgette Leonet, and he instantly enchanted by the 16-year-old. A few weeks later, Ed's birth certificate arrived from Anna, who might have felt it safe to send since Marcel was out of the picture after the battalion moved. In the same batch of mail, he received a letter from two more Irish girls. But if his mother felt relieved that Ed had come to his senses and forgotten about marrying the French girl, it wouldn't last long. Anna soon learned that Ed had fallen hard for the beautiful young Georgette.
So you had to wait a couple years. What were the laws back then?
I think he could, yeah, I don't know. I think
So
he had
does
to
he go
wait.
back to the States after the war, or does he decide to settle down in France?
So, he says, Ed still had not written from France to Anne Wyman nor any of the girls who apparently answered his mother's call to correspond with him. Instead, he pushed for Anna's approval of 16-year-old Georgette, the daughter of a local businessman. That fall, his mother opened a letter to read of his French love. And here's the letter.
Okay, wait, before you read it. Now, this is the fall of 1918. Okay, so this was, I think, right before the breakout of the Spanish flu, which
Yep.
devastated Europe. Go ahead.
Yep. I've known her and her family for a long time, and I've found them to be okay. She's attending one of the best schools in France now, learning English. Her folks want to know your opinion before they declare themselves. I told them what you wrote me before, but they said that you neither said that you did or did not approve of it. You merely gave your opinion on married life. And so Ed, Georgette, and Lucille were in the Tuileries garden when they heard the loud boom of cannon fired near the Eiffel Tower, announcing Wilson's arrival. They hurried quickly to the Avenue des Champs-Élysées in time to see Wilson in a carriage with the French President Ramon Poincaré tipping his hat to the throngs as he passed by. So Wilson was, I think, Woodrow Wilson.
So this must be. I don't think he came in 1918, Wilson. Maybe this is 1919 already.
Yeah. Um, Georgia became frustrated, waiting for Ed's mother to send her approval of the romance, and took matters into her own hands by writing to Anna in December in her best English.
What a gal.
My dear mother, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Your daughter, Georgette Viconet. Ed added to the letter, I wish you the same.
Your daughter. Why did they get married without her consent?
Yeah,
People were very serious about marriage back then. A parental consent was a sign that the family would back it. You wouldn't
yeah.
be left out in the cold. And
So, see here. We got married in 1920. Let's see here.
okay, so they waited 2 years until she was 18.
Yeah. So, yeah.
This is a good example why it's important to raise your children to be mature individuals, even when they're 12, because they need to have the prudence, self-control necessary to marry when they're 18, which is the normal age. Not marrying when they're 35 or 42, that's just not normal.
Yeah. So, while the brothers are trying to raise up $250 for a passage to France, um, Ed and Georgette, nevertheless, were soon expecting an addition to their household. A baby was on the way.
Okay. So they got married in 1920 or
Mm,
1919. Hmm. So he was still in the army in France. He remained there. He didn't head home after the war.
So, Jack Edwin Ryan was born July 7th, 1921, into a home where French was the spoken language, a deciding factor in the course of his life. A dark-eyed, serious baby, he looked more French than Irish. His name would be Jack, while to the others he was Jacques, with only a slight difference in pronunciation. The
Jacques.
early
Yeah.
the early years of marriage were sweet, especially sweet for Georgette, who merely pushed Jack about in the carriage. His neighbors in Nogent-sur-Seine fussed over the little boy with curly, uncut locks. Still a teenager, she was surrounded by her loving husband, her family, and her beautiful baby. Ed continued to make the most of his days in France, visiting exotic sites with spectacular architecture. As he traveled with father-in-law Georges Leconet for work, he also kept in touch with the American expatriates by joining the American Legion Post 1 in Paris, which had been founded shortly after the end of the World War to bolster the morale of American soldiers who were facing a long wait before returning home.
Hmm. Sounds like he was already discharged because the American Legions were veterans. So that means that they got married in 20, 2 years after the war. The war ends in 18, I think, if I remember correctly. It looks like he's got there after the influenza. My grandfather was in the First World War, my maternal grandfather, and he was a barber in one of the army divisions. And he caught the Spanish flu, and he was sick and came very close to death. And I had to be shipped out to Nantes to a hospital. And the American soldiers found the French women very beautiful. At the end of my grandfather's life, when I was going through his thing, he had a little wooden box that he had packed his most personal items in when he sent it back from the First World War. And in there was a little libretto from a theater where he and his friends went and saw the dancing girls. And so he kept that his whole life. Though he had a bit more self-control. He ended up marrying a Sicilian girl. So I don't have any French blood in me. So, but the Irish are a bit more untamed.
Yeah. Liconet's stress over the business was compounded by their increasing worry that their oldest daughter and their first grandchild would go to America. If you leave, we'll never see Jacques again, Lucille lamented to Georgette, but Ed had no choice but to pull up stakes in Georgette, and he voyaged to the United States in November 1922 with his young French wife, his 1-year-old son, and $28 in his pocket. They settled into an apartment in Hoboken, New Jersey, about a mile from the Hudson River, and 4 blocks from where 7-year-old Frank Sinatra lived.
Hoboken. Yes. When my relatives came over, they also came to New York too. My grandfather came over in 26, but $20 in your pocket. You want to talk about self-confidence? You know, so many young men today say, I can't marry, I only have so much money. I can't travel, I only have so much money, you know? You know, if there was one thing about the men of our grandfathers and great grandfathers' generation was they had a lot of confidence, a lot of self-confidence. They had a lot of hope for the future. They were hard workers, and they knew with hard work and saving up your money, it didn't matter how much money you had now, you could achieve a future, and that puts to shame all the recent generations. And this is a wonderful example of the hope and outlook young people should have, and of the fact that their parents shouldn't fret over these things so much
Mm,
if they
So,
raise their children to have a good character and be strong faith and virtue.
so what a change for Georgia, and how will she adapt to a new life? Lucille wrote to Ed's sister Florence after the move. I am also sorry to see my dear little Jacques depart. I only lost one daughter, but 3 children because I love Edwin and Jacques so much. The American Legion Employment Service in New York steered Ed toward a job at Macy's department store in Manhattan, where he donned a smart uniform and served as combination doorman and customer service representative, assisting shoppers. And Georgette was somewhat of a captive in the New Jersey apartment with Jack, since the family couldn't afford a telephone and she spoke only a little English. She and Ed continued to converse in French while her English improved with the help of a French to English dictionary she bought along with when she went out to shop with her long haired little boy. While Ed's work at Macy's was interesting, it didn't pay well, and he took odd jobs to help with the household finances. He worked as a bouncer for a time in Chin Lee's Chop Suey House in New York's theater district, where he picked up another part-time gig wearing the uniform of a British colonel and parading in front of the George M. Cohan Theater to promote the production of A Holy Terror. He finally resorted to shoveling coal for Edison Light and Power at docks on the East River after living abroad and sampling continental culture. He found himself in the unidentified kind of job that he associated with his father, but it paid more than his 3 other jobs combined.
Now, this is a wonderful example, and I'm always telling this to men who are looking for work. Don't be peculiar about what job. Take what God sends you. You'll pick up a lot of talents. It will build character. And, that's the manly thing to do. You have some people like, I'm not going to take any job unless it's an exact this kind of position and this kind of an institute. It's ridiculous.
So finances were beginning to improve when a new expense presented itself.
Second kid?
Mhm. A second child was on the way and decided it was time to return home to Minneapolis.
Better than shoveling coal.
Yeah.
And this is another thing that we'll see of in the generations past, our grandfathers, great grandfather generation. When they start having a family, what's almost the first thing they do? They move to the countryside. They move back to their homeland. They want a place where it's going to be a good environment for their kids to be raised. These are men who are real fathers. They weren't wanting the family to revolve about them. They thought of the family first, and even if that meant giving up their jobs and moving.
Yeah. About the same time that Anna Ryan was leaving, Georgette was planning a move with her own children, a voyage with Jack and George aboard the SS France, which had ferried American soldiers to Europe during World War One. She took the boys to Nogent-sur-Seine to live with her family while she attended the École de Coiffure in Paris to learn to become a hairdresser. She and Ed had spoken French in their home since they had married in 1920, so the boys were familiar enough with the two languages to easily fit into the household of grandparents Georges and Lucille. Jack had lived in Nogent for the first year of his life, so the French came especially easy to him. But still, it was a bit of a culture shock for the two boys used to sledding during the frigid winters, swimming in Minneapolis lakes in the blistering heat, running with the gaggle of neighborhood boys who spoke English. On top of that, Jack and George were sent to school in Nogent wearing gingham aprons for the equivalent of third grade in kindergarten. Georgette returned with her sons to Minneapolis in 1929 and opened a hair salon on busy Hennepin Avenue, a 10-minute bus ride from home. With impressive credentials from Parsons and dressing school, her business was good, but she felt she wasn't meeting her son's needs and moved her equipment into the family's home.
Mhm. Yeah, that was the real rage in the 28, 29. It's called the flapper age. All the women wanted a French hairdresser, so.
So Jack and George shared a love of sports, particularly University of Minnesota football, which was in the midst of its glory years under coach Bernie Bierman, winning three straight national championships from 1934 to 1936. The boys listened to games broadcast on the radio by their father's old grade school buddy, Hazley Hall, who had started referring to Minnesota as the Golden Gophers because of their uniforms. They also listened to Hall on Minneapolis Miller's minor league baseball games. While Hall had begun as a sports writer, he had found his stride as a radio broadcaster and claimed the exclamation of "Holy cow!" as his own, as a call that Phil Risotto, Harry Carey, and others would use in years to come. The Ryan boys, like their parents, were a contrast. Jack more closely resembled Georgette in both his French looks and his serious demeanor, which combined with Ed's attention on him as the older son to create a focused, hard-working student. George had more of a jovial Irish in him, along with the free spirit that comes from the fewer parental restrictions that younger siblings typically enjoy. Jack posed seriously in family photos while George made faces behind his parents' backs and got away with it until his parents were developed as developed at the drugstore. When the two boys attended the overnight camp that required them to write home, Jack wrote to his mother in French, about what he was doing, including woodworking. George wrote in English that he had gained 2 or 3 pounds since arriving. Georgia saw to it that music was part of the boy's upbringing. He arranged lessons for both on the family's piano. Jack practiced seriously and would become an accomplished musician, while George would give up music for sports. Jack described the Ryan family in an uninspired school assignment titled My Family. My family is made up of 4 persons, which are my father, mother, and younger brother, and myself. My father is a tall, heavily built man of Irish descent. His occupation is that of a detective. Mother is French and she has lived in France through her girlhood days, and her parents are still living over there. When we returned to France 6 years ago, she went to Paris to study beauty culture. She now runs a beauty shop. My brother is 10 years old and learned the French language at 3. I would not say he is an exceptionally bright boy, for he does not always get along with his teachers. As for me, the only thing different of other children was that I was born in France and trying my best to succeed.
He said to his brother that he's not particularly bright.
Yep.
Rivalry.
So that ends the first.
The making of Jack Ryan. So he had, this is he's like a Hollywood style movie here. It's so fascinating and unique of origins, and reminds me of the story we did about my divorce's parents, how his mother was from England and married after the Second World War and brought her to the United States. So
Yeah.
we'll see that this unique and international background is going to enable Jack to do things that and be able to do things that many Irish Catholics never achieved. And you guess you call them, say, Irish French Catholic. So, but from a very good family, God fearing, community, active in their community, willing to come to the defense of their country, home or abroad, um, gun right family, family believe in guns, a family believes it's important to stay together and uh, and important to live for the benefit of the whole family, not just for staying in one place for the benefit maybe a few.
Yeah.
And a family willing to take hardship and keep practicing the faith throughout it all. And a family that doesn't forget about relatives, even distance away, and a family whose relatives on both sides helped.
Yeah.
And we're concerned about the welfare. And these are all important values that among the grandparents and parents that create children who can go on to do great things. And it's a very important example we need for the present day Catholic revival.
So on the next episode of the real Jack Ryan, you'll see what got him into the military and where he served during World War II.
Okay, and how he gets involved in with the FBI and the CIA, perhaps. So this
Yeah.
will be fascinating. And thank you, AJ, for having me on for this. The life of the real Jack Ryan, Catholic hero, and wholly unknown. We need more stories like this for us Catholics. We don't know our history.
Yep. So this is Order Military Studio TV signing off. That's all.
Days full.